Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Dawn and David Viens? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Dawn Marie Viens was born on March 16, 1970, in Burlington, Vermont. In 1988, she graduated from high school. In the mid-1990s, while working at a hotel as a hostess, she met a coworker named David Viens, who worked as a cook. David had a criminal past. In 1993, he had been convicted for distribution of cocaine. When Dawn met him, David had 3 children and was in the middle of a divorce. The couple became romantically involved and married in 1997. They moved to Florida and opened a restaurant. In 2005, David was convicted on a federal marijuana charge and sentenced to 1 year in prison. In 2008, David and Dawn moved to Lomita, California, which is just south of Los Angeles. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on Oak Avenue. In September 2009, the couple opened a restaurant in Lomita called the Time Contemporary Cafe. David worked as the chef, and Dawn worked as the hostess. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On November 8, 2009, Dawn's sister went to the police and reported Dawn missing because no one had seen her since October 18. The police spoke to David. He told them that Dawn left after arguing with him, and he had not been in contact with her since. He didn't report her missing because he thought she was using drugs with her friends and would return later. On December 9, David spoke to the police again and offered a different story. Now he said that a week after Dawn left, she returned home smelling of alcohol. 2 days later, she left again. Over the next few weeks, he communicated with her a few times. Dawn explained how she loved him and needed time to work things out. The police were suspicious about David's story and continued to investigate Dawn's disappearance. Here's what they found. On Sunday, October 18, 2009, at about 10 p.m., David was in the Time Contemporary Cafe with an acquaintance named Richard and a man who was interviewing to be a cook. He explained to them that Dawn was drinking too much and not doing her job. It was embarrassing to have her in the restaurant, and she was a sloppy mess. As David was reviewing restaurant receipts, he said, quote, "That blank is stealing from me, and nobody steals from me, and I will kill that blank," unquote. At 11:49 p.m., Dawn called Richard. During their conversation, Richard explained to Dawn how David accused her of stealing. Dawn started crying hysterically. The pair exchanged a few more telephone calls that night. After those calls, Richard never heard from Dawn again. On the next day, Monday, October 19, David had a meeting with his employees at the restaurant. He told them that Dawn would no longer be working there, but offered no explanation for this change. On Tuesday, October 20, 2009, Dawn was supposed to meet her friend Karen at a hospital where Karen was being treated, but Dawn never showed up. Concerned about Dawn, Karen and her husband stopped by the restaurant to check on her. She wasn't there, but they spoke to David, who appeared to be agitated and distraught. He was drenched in sweat and had a bandage on his hand. David explained how he argued with Dawn after she refused to go to rehab and she left him. He also accused Dawn of stealing money from the restaurant. Karen wanted to know why Dawn's Jeep was in the parking lot. David explained that the vehicle was not registered or not working properly. He appeared to be aggravated by Karen's questions. At one point, when referring to Dawn, David said, "Good riddance." 3 days later, on Friday, October 23, Karen asked David about Dawn. He claimed that he had been in touch with her via telephone and text messages. Dawn told him she needed time away. During the afternoon, Karen received a text message from Dawn's cell phone indicating that Dawn needed time to think. Karen was suspicious because the message contained grammatical errors, and Dawn misspelled a nickname she used for herself. Later, another text message came in saying that Dawn was moving back east and would supply a new phone number after getting settled. Karen continued trying to get in touch with Dawn over the next few weeks, but did not have any success. She also spoke to David, who kept offering different stories about what Dawn might be doing. Within a couple weeks of Dawn's disappearance, David started a romantic relationship with one of his employees named Kathy. She was in her early 20s, whereas David was in his late 40s. One time when Kathy was at his apartment, she noticed that Dawn's belongings were still there. David told her not to worry about it. Dawn left him, and the marriage was over. In November 2009, Kathy moved into David's apartment. During this same month, David's daughter, Jacqueline, arrived in Lomita to help her father with the restaurant at his request. One night, David and his daughter, Jacqueline, were both intoxicated as they drove home together from the restaurant. David told his daughter a story. He said that he had argued with Dawn one night in the apartment. She was bothering him, so he placed clear packing tape around her hands, feet, and mouth and left her on the living room floor. David went to sleep in a bedroom. When he woke up, he found that Dawn had died in her own vomit. He explained it was an accident and Dawn's body would never be found. At David's request, Jacqueline sent a message to one of Dawn's friends from Dawn's cell phone, stating that Dawn was okay. Jacqueline then disposed of the cell phone to protect her father. In October 2010, the police searched the apartment where David had lived. By this time, he and Kathy had moved out. Bloodstains were found in the bathroom, but the samples were too degraded for testing. On February 22, 2011, the police spoke to David's daughter, Jacqueline. She told them what her father told her about accidentally killing Dawn. The next day, David told his lover, Kathy, that he killed Dawn by accident. After this disclosure, he drove to a scenic overlook in Rancho Palos Verdes. He ran to the edge of an 80-foot cliff and jumped off. Amazingly, David's attempt at a gravity-assisted demise was unsuccessful. Emergency responders transported him to a hospital with serious injuries, but he was alive. In the hospital, David told the police the same thing he had told Jacqueline and Kathy. His wife died after he restrained her with tape. In order to destroy evidence, David put Dawn's body in a vat of boiling water and slow-cooked it for 4 days. He then mixed her remains with grease and debris and placed them in a dumpster behind the restaurant. He claimed that he kept her skull in his mother's attic, but the police did not find it there. David Viens was charged with murder. In 2012, he went to trial and was found guilty of second-degree murder. By this time, he had changed his story about how he disposed of his wife's body. He said that he did not use the slow cooking method. Rather, he simply put her body in the dumpster behind the restaurant. He told the judge, quote, "I loved my wife. I didn't cook my wife," unquote. David Viens received a term of 15 years to life in prison. In 2021, he went before the parole board. David implied that he could do great things if he was released. He wanted to become some type of anger management therapist who specialized in domestic violence. This would be like Charles Manson arguing for parole by explaining how he could open a daycare. The board declined David's parole, saying that he needed more mental health counseling. Now moving to my analysis. David Viens admitted that he caused his wife's death, but his defense argued that he did not commit second-degree murder. That charge requires malice. What David did was more like voluntary manslaughter. David claimed that he wrapped tape around his wife in response to her harassing him, so she offered some type of provocation. The state, of course, disagrees. They argued there is plenty of evidence to prove David acted with malice. Does David have a point, or was the state correct? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that David was guilty of second-degree murder, starting with the inculpatory factors. In the summer prior to her death, Dawn gave $640 in cash to a man who owned a motorcycle shop near the cafe. She asked him to hold it for her. This makes it seem like Dawn was planning on leaving David. She needed some money put aside to make her escape. On the last day she was seen alive, she called the man and told him she had more money to drop off to him. In August 2009, Dawn's friend Karen saw red marks on her neck. Dawn told Karen that David had been drinking and tried to strangle her. She also mentioned other incidents of violence perpetrated by David. In September 2009, the month before Dawn disappeared, she called Karen late one night and said she locked herself in the bathroom of the apartment she shared with David. David was angry with her, and she was afraid he was going to beat her. Karen could hear David pounding on the door and yelling. She offered to call the police, but Dawn said no because David would lose the restaurant. Later, Dawn contacted Karen and said that David fell asleep. During one afternoon in October 2009, a neighbor heard disturbing noises coming from the apartment that Dawn and David shared, like arguing and objects being thrown. About 15 minutes later, Dawn stormed out. David admitted to killing his wife, although he argued it was non-intentional. The police found blood in the bathroom that they couldn't test, but the blood should not have been there based on David's account of the killing. After the killing, David engaged in a gruesome body disposal, which he claimed involved slow cooking his wife over the course of 4 days. David staged an elaborate cover-up, which included fake text messages. He denigrated his wife's character, saying that she was stealing, using drugs, and that she ran off with another man. Within 2 weeks of the killing, David became romantically involved with another woman. When David realized that he was going to be arrested, he traveled over a cliff. Even if David is telling the truth about how he killed his wife, it would not qualify as voluntary manslaughter. This charge requires that a person acted in the heat of passion after a substantial provocation. There was no evidence that Dawn provoked David in a manner consistent with voluntary manslaughter. Moving to the exculpatory factors, technically, David could be telling the truth about how he killed his wife. If she did provoke him, there would not necessarily be any evidence of that behavior. David may not have slow-cooked his wife. He was on a lot of drugs in the hospital when he told the police the story, and they did not find the skull where David said it would be. Furthermore, during the time he was supposedly doing this, the restaurant was open and filled with employees who may have noticed a human body being cooked in the kitchen. When considering all the evidence, do I believe that David is guilty of second-degree murder? Yes, he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, in my opinion. Furthermore, David should never be released from prison. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. David Viens was self-centered, charismatic, antisocial, sensation-seeking, impulsive, irresponsible, aggressive, petty, irritable, antagonistic, shallow, grandiose, angry, had low frustration tolerance, violated societal norms, and had a sense of entitlement. Both he and his wife consumed massive quantities of alcohol. They were like two peas in a pod and believed the alcohol would spice things up. Eventually, however, their negative characteristics were too hot to handle. Each of them bit off more than they could chew. It was a recipe for disaster. It is reasonable to believe that Dawn was taking money from the restaurant. Maybe not as much as David claimed, but some of the dough was definitely missing. Dawn was hoping the money would be her ticket to a gravy train, but as it turned out, she was in hot water. David's frustration went from a simmer to boiling over, and Dawn was moving out of the frying pan and into the fire. To calm David down, Dawn walked on eggshells and buttered him up, but David, being a bad apple, was a hard nut to crack. David murdered Dawn in the heat of the moment and found himself in quite the pickle. Wanting to avoid having egg on his face, David cooked up a whopper of a story for why his wife went missing. Ultimately, I don't think that David actually cooked his wife. Rather, he just made up the story as the police grilled him. David is not happy about being incarcerated, but remorse is not on the menu. Guilt is not eating him alive. Even so, prison is not his cup of tea, but it is the only dish he will be served for a while. Those are my thoughts on the case of Dawn and David Viens. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.